All right, let's go ahead and get started. I missed a couple people, but that's okay. Okay, so on Tuesday we talked about some different styles we can use to apply to text elements, so font and color, that kind of thing. Now we're going to jump into how to kind of move things around in CSS, how to adjust sizes and margins and padding and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and jump in. So we're going to talk about what's called the CSS box model. So if you think about it, every element in your HTML is a rectangular box. And if you use the inspector or the developer tools, you'll see like when you selected an element, it'll show you the rectangle on the page and kind of highlight that box for you. So every element in HTML is a rectangular box. So we can use CSS to adjust the properties of these boxes. So that's why we call it the box model. So we can adjust the size, the dimensions, height, and width. We can also adjust the border of any HTML element. So we can add a border or remove a border depending on if there's one by default or not. So things like a field set element has a border by default, but we could remove it or we could change it. We can also adjust the padding. So we'll talk about padding a little bit more, but that's the space inside of the border, or the margin, which is kind of the space outside the border around between an element and elements that surround it. So for example, we could add this is something you can do to kind of see all of the boxes on a page. Is you could use the universal selector and do like border 1 pixel solid red, and it will outline every single element with a red border, and it kind of lets you see, okay, like there's a bunch of boxes on this page, and you can kind of understand how the layout was built by seeing all of the boxes used to make up that page. So first is the box dimension. So height and width properties can be used to control the dimensions of HTML elements. So we would use this for all sorts of things. A lot of times you'll use this, with text elements, you usually only want to do one or the other, height or width. You don't usually want to constrain a paragraph unless you know that it's never going to change. But you might want to say, the width of these paragraphs is only going to be 80 pixels so that it won't be any wider than that, something along those lines. So pixels are the easiest and most accurate way to adjust the height and width. It's really precise. It's never going to change. It's going to be the same on every screen size. Pixels are a really precise way to do it. You can also use percentages for height and width. So percentages for height and width will be relative to the size of the browser window. So if you say width 50% on an element, it will take up 50% of the browser's window, whatever the width of the window is. Or if the box is wrapped by another element, it might be a percentage of the containing box. So say you've got a div, and then you've got a paragraph inside that div, and say you've got the div at 50% width, and then you tell the paragraph 50% width, that paragraph then would be 50% of the width available to it, which would be 25% of the total page. So a good way to think of percentages is how much space is available to the element, and whatever percentage you give it will be what percentage of the available space it has. So either relative to the browser window, if it's got the full width to work with, or if it's constrained by a parent element, it'll be a percentage of what's available to it. You can also use IMs here, which we've talked about with font sizing. It'll size the box relative to the text within it. It can be a little bit useful for creating designs that are a little bit more flexible across different screen sizes. It can have some behavior that you don't expect, though. I recommend sticking with pixels or percentages, kind of depending on your needs. IMs can be a little bit unpredictable when dealing with height and width, but it's an option. So here's some examples. So say we have a div with class intro, and we don't want it to take up the full width of the page. We could say width 80% on that div, and that div here would only take up 80% of the width of the page at that point. Then say we target a paragraph inside of that div, and we say width 50%. The paragraph is now going to take 50% of the width of its parent, which is this div, is at 80, so it would be 40% of the page. Or we could target, a list item within that div, and it would have a height of 4 inches, something along those lines. So width and height, relatively straightforward. You can use it to kind of move, change the sizes of things on your page. You can also limit size in different ways. So, websites can be designed to expand or shrink to fit the user's screen. Sometimes stuff will move around a little bit on your page for different reasons. So you can use min width and min height to specify the smallest box that a size can be displayed. And similarly, we have max width and max height to specify the largest size that a box can be. So these are really useful. They're especially useful. They're definitely useful when considering mobile browsers. So, sometimes you want something to be, 50% width or 20% width or something. But if you look at it on a phone, it's like, shrink super small because, especially if they're in portrait mode on their phone, there's not a lot of width to work with, right? And now 20% of the width of a mobile phone is really, really tiny. And if I've seen websites that will do this and they've got a paragraph that's 20% width, and you pull it up on your phone and you see like one word at a time because all the width the paragraph has to work with is so small that it's just crammed in there and you can't really read it. So you could use min width and say, give it a pixel value or give it a percentage, something along those lines to say, okay, this paragraph should be 20%, but don't let it go smaller than 100 pixels wide. So that on a smaller screen, it still has a large enough width. Similarly, you could use max width to say, no larger than 200 pixels wide, so that on a big, wide screen, it doesn't just stretch all the way across, but it has kind of a constrained proportion. You can also use, min height and max height can be useful in those ways too. I use these a lot when you're building like more like web applications, something that has some interactivity. Sometimes you want like an area for content that may be empty if the user hasn't inputted any content. So you'd give it a max width or a max height, min height, to say like leave some space for that content. A good example would be like if you were like, I don't know, building like an email client or something where there was a form and an input box. You could have your input box have your text area have a min height, so that when the user keeps typing, it just expands, as the user types. Both of these properties can take pixels, percentages, or ems as well. So again, example, we've got our div class intro. Min width is 300 pixels. It'll never be smaller than that, no matter what, how small the screen is. Okay, overflow content. So what happens if the content inside a box is larger than the box itself? So say we have a paragraph that has, we've got a paragraph tag. It has, 200 words in it. It's going to take up some amount of space. But we say, height 2 pixels, width 2 pixels. Okay, the content's not going to fit in a 2 pixel by 2 pixel box. What happens? So the overflow property will tell the browser what to do when that happens. So there's a couple of options. One is show. So show is the default value, and it will show all of the overflowing content. It basically, the height and width will be honored, and other elements may take up space that element would otherwise have taken up. As far as the display and the layout goes, the height and width are honored. But the actual content will spill out of, the dimensions of your box and still show no matter what. So That's the default. So if you have a paragraph and you set it, it's usually going to still show the content. Hidden, however, will hide any extra content that doesn't fit within the bounds of your box. So if you do overflow hidden, it's going to actually hide everything for you. Scroll, however, is another option that will add a scroll bar to the box, so users can scroll to see the missing content. And there's a scroll, or it's actually overflow-x and overflow-y to even specify, the x-axis, which would be horizontal, or the y-axis. So you can have it scroll vertically but not horizontally, things like that as well. I don't want to go over that in this slide, but there's an option as well to specify, horizontal versus vertical. So 3 options. We can show the content no matter what the dimensions, if they're spilling out. We can hide it all, or we can have the user scroll. Kind of different situations call for different ones. I'll use scroll a lot if it's some sort of, user inputted content that I want to show on the screen, but I don't want it to take up a ton of extra space if the user's gone on and on and on. Think of almost like it's a little bit different on Facebook, but like if you type a really long post on Facebook, it still kind of hides it. And then there's a little more button, and you could click that more button. That's some JavaScript. But they could instead do scroll and let you scroll within the little space that you have, for your post if the content is longer. You definitely wouldn't want it to just be show, because then, the content could take up all the space on the page. Or hidden, the user's never going to see that extra content that got cut off. So you've got to come up with some strategy to make it reasonable dimension-wise, but still have the content be available. Whereas like hidden, trying to think of times that I've used overflow hidden. Maybe sometimes where, user input or user content could move things around and cause stuff to spill off the page, but it's not important content. Something like an image, sometimes like a background image, you might want, if you've got a background image on a page, you want to constrain the proportions, use overflow hidden. Even if the image is bigger for some reason or smaller, it's not going to, appear larger than what the image is. So anyway, those are the ways that we deal with the content spilling out. So border margin and padding, really important. So every box has 3 properties that can be adjusted to control its appearance. So the border separates the edge of one box from another. So if you've got 2 boxes that are next to each other, the border is kind of what's in between. It goes all the way around the box. The margin sits outside the edge of the border and can create a gap between the borders of 2 adjacent boxes. So you've got border, and then on the outside of the border is your margin. So if you've got a red border around every element on your page, they're all going to butt up against each other. But if you add some margin to the page, it's going to space out those borders a little bit. One note is if the bottom margin of any box touches the top margin of another, the larger of the 2 margins will be used. And if they're the same, only one will be applied. So that's just a way of saying that margins above and below boxes don't stack. It kind of combines down into whatever the largest value is. So it's a pretty important thing to know. Padding doesn't have the same issue. Padding will be applied no matter what, but margin will condense vertically if 2 elements have margin. Padding is the space between the border of the box and any content inside of the box. So if you've got a paragraph, you add a border and then you add some padding. It's going to space the content from the border. So it's going to add some internal margin, essentially. So margin is external to the element. Padding is internal to the element. So from the border in and kind of condensing it in. That's really useful. If you've got like some sort of, box on your page with some text in it, you don't want the text going right up to the edges of the border. You want to add some padding in there, add some spacing. So margin and padding are very helpful in adding white space between items on the page. So white space is just what we call empty space or negative space on our page. And it's pretty important to have to use white space to kind of space things out a little bit. It makes it more readable. Nobody likes a website that feels really crammed and condensed. It can be hard to read. It's hard to see the separation between items. So margin and padding are very important to space things out a little bit. So here's an example kind of illustrating the differences. So here we have the box. So this could be a paragraph or a div with some text in it. Everything that's shaded green is our actual element. So we've got a border like this kind of darker green, goes all the way around. Notice the height and the width are indicated by this dotted line. So whatever, this from here to here is the height, and whatever from here to here is the width. We've got padding, which goes inside the border, but is in addition to the height and the width of the page. So if this was a paragraph, the text would start right here and, flow all the way to this bottom right corner of the height and width. So the padding is how we separate the content from the border a little bit and add some of that internal spacing. And you notice it's different on the left than it is on the top and the bottom. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So then outside of the border is where the margin is. So we could have another element that would be right here that would go all the way up to wherever our margin starts. So again, padding is inside of the border, between the border and the content. Margin is outside of the border, between the border and other elements on the page. I think I have another. So here's like a really simple, this could be like a span with just the word hello in it. So we've got our border here, the padding is between the border and the content, and the margin is from the border outside around other elements. Again, just trying to illustrate a little bit. Here's a good example too of why we use it. Obviously the one on the left here looks a lot better than the one on the right. The one on the right would just be the default. So say these are each paragraphs and they've got some text in them. By default these paragraphs are going to be one after the other. Their borders double up because they're crammed next to each other. There's not any space between the border and the content. So by adding a little bit of margin, we're spacing out the borders of each paragraph. So we're moving each paragraph away from the others. And then we add some padding on the inside between the border and the content. So here, no padding, here padding, which spaces it out a little bit and makes it look a lot better. So really, really important to add some margin and padding to space things out. Looks much better. Okay, so border width property is used to control the width of a border. It accepts values in pixels, or there's some shorthand values. You can use thin, medium, or thick in place of a pixel value, and they correlate to certain pixel values. Individual border widths can be controlled with these properties. So you could say border top width to just adjust the width of the top border, border right width, border bottom width, so on and so forth, to specify how wide the border should be on that side of the box. So it's very flexible. You can also combine different widths for the 4 border values in this shorthand kind of format. We'll see this a lot in CSS. Anytime there's something where you can adjust 4 sides of something, you can usually adjust all of them in one rule. By specifying the top, right, bottom, and then left in that order. So top, right, bottom, left. So the top border would have a 2-pixel width, the right one would have 1 pixel, the bottom would have 1 pixel, and left would have 2 pixels. So we'll see that pattern a lot. So that's just setting the width of the border. So how wide should the border be around our element? In addition to border width, we have the border style. So it controls the style of the border, and there's a couple different values. There's solid for just a solid line. You can also do dotted for a dotted line, or dashed, double. Groove, ridge, inset, and outset kind of do a 3D effect. So it'll either look like a 3D groove or inset or outset. It kind of makes it look like your text is engraved or something, or the box is engraved into um, or embossed, popping out for outset. You can also do hidden or none, which will do no border. So that's useful too, especially, say you don't want a border around your field set. You could target your field set and say border style none, and the field set would no longer have a border around it. Like width, border styles can be changed using your specific properties. So you can do border top style, border left style, so on and so forth. Okay, and then border color. So you can set the color of your border using border color, accepts any color values that we've talked about so far. You can also use border top color, border bottom color, border left color, so on and so forth. Again, or you can do the shorthand. You can just say border color, red, green, blue, yellow, and that's going to do top, right, bottom, and left in that order. So here's an example of combining all of these. So we could target a div. We say border width is 1 pixel, border style is solid, and border color is red. And now we're going to have a solid red 1 pixel border around our element. There's also a shorthand version to set all 3 of those properties in the same rule. So we can just do border. So we've got border style, border width, border color. We can combine all of them in just border. And we provide the width, then the style, then the color. So we're targeting the same div. We just say border, 1 pixel, solid red. It's kind of a shorthand way to provide all of those values. So you can do it either way. There's definitely uses to have, do the individual ones. Sometimes, especially if you're using like Bootstrap or a framework or some sort of theme, they may already have a border around some elements and you just want to adjust the color of the border, but you don't want to adjust any of the other properties, just set border color. But if you're doing your own borders there's no border and you're adding a border, you could just do the shorthand border property to set all of them in one handy rule. Any questions about border? Anything else so far? Okay. Padding. So again, padding is between the border and the content inside of the element. The value of the property, usually you specify in pixels, although it's possible to do percentages or ems, but it gets kind of hairy. It's kind of unpredictable sometimes what that percentage is going to be. We pretty much recommend that you just use pixels for padding and margin. So if you just do padding and then the pixel value, that property will be applied to all sides. So it's really easy to use, just padding and then 10 pixels, and I'll add 10 pixels of padding for all sides of the element. Like border, you can also specify each individual side. So you can do padding top, padding bottom, padding left, padding right, to just do the padding on a certain side. That's definitely useful. There's definitely times where some elements you might want top and bottom padding, but you don't need left and right padding. You can use padding top or padding bottom to do that. Similarly, there's also the shorthand for this. So you can do the top, right, left, or top, right, bottom, and left in that order by just specifying those pixel numbers. There's also an alternative shorthand for padding and margin where you can do top and bottom and left and right in the same rule. So you can just say padding 20 pixels space 10 pixels. And your browser knows if there's only 2 values, you're setting the top and bottom at the same time and left and right at the same time. Whereas if there's 4 values, you're setting each side individually. So again, just a couple of different ways to do the same thing. Questions about padding? Okay, margin, very, very similar. Again, we're controlling the gap between boxes, between the border and another border. Again, the value is usually given in pixels. Again, as we talked about, if one box sits on top of another, their margins are collapsed and the largest one is used. That's really important to keep in mind. So again, we just set margin and 10 pixels. We can also do specific sides, margin left, margin top, so on and so forth. We can also do the shorthand where we set all four, and we can do top and bottom and left and right at the same time. One thing to talk about with centering content, so we talked about text align. So you can do text align center to make the text be aligned in the center of an element. But that doesn't necessarily affect the positioning of a actual element. It's just affecting the flow of the contents inside that element. So say you have an image, and it's somewhere on your page. Doing text align center on an image doesn't necessarily center the image within the div. It may sometimes, but not always. It certainly wouldn't affect, like actually moving a div relative to the other elements around it. So there's kind of a trick where you can do margin left and margin right, set them to auto. So you're saying the left margin and the right margin should be automatically calculated to whatever it needs to be to position it right in the middle. This is kind of something that was added after there was kind of a dark time in CSS where you would, if you wanted to center an element, you would figure out, okay, well, it's 200 pixels wide, and there's 400 pixels space for it, but I want it to be centered, so I'll say margin left is 100 pixels and margin right is 100 pixels. So that would, adding that left and right margin would center it, within the space available to it. But that gets really hairy. You have to be able to, you never want to be like calculating pixels on your page, especially with the advent of responsive layouts and mobile devices. Things change. You might want to use percentages instead of pixels. You just don't really want to mess with calculating how to position, your element centered that way. So setting both margin left and margin right to auto tells the browser to automatically calculate the pixels needed to make it centered. You also need a width set, so otherwise it'll take up the full width of the page. So, say you've got a paragraph, you've set the width to 400 pixels, margin left and margin right are auto, it'll center it within whatever space it has available. So definitely useful. So here's an example, div intro, we've got width 50%, margin left and margin right are both auto. You can also do like 10 pixels auto to add top and bottom 10 pixels, and then left and right would be auto. Anyway, really important to keep in mind that's an option. Okay, we talked a little bit about inline and block elements. So inline elements just flow in line with the text. They don't get a new line by default. So things like links are inline, strong or emphasis tags are inline. They don't want to break out to a new line. They're just within your text. So you can use the display property to turn an inline element into a block element or vice versa. So it just changes the way that it's displayed. It can take a couple of different properties. So inline will cause a block level element to act like an inline element. Block does the same thing but in reverse. There's also a handy thing called inline-block, which causes a block level element to flow like an inline element while still retaining the other features of a block level element, such as width and height. So an important thing to remember, inline elements, height and width are pretty much ignored for the most part with inline elements. So like if you have a strong tag and you give it a width of 200 pixels, it's not going to be applied because it's inline. It's supposed to flow in line with the text. You shouldn't be setting it a width to it anyway, right? Because then it would no longer flow within the text. So the browser assumes that you didn't mean to set a width on your inline element and it just ignores it. However, if you want it to flow within the text, like an inline element, but to also have some of those height and width features, you can use inline block to say, okay, treat it like a block element as far as height and width and margin and all those things go, but still flow within the text. Thanks, man. So that can definitely be really useful. So say, an example is like if you have a link within some paragraph of text, and for whatever reason you want, say that you've styled your links like buttons. so they're kind of more of a block level element at that point. You want the buttons to still flow within the text, but you want it to be a little bit wider than it otherwise would be, or have some margin or padding or something like that. You could use inline block to do that. We use inline block a ton with images as well. So we want our images to flow within our text, but we want to constrain their proportions, or we want to add margin around an image. By default, images are inline. They're not going to get any margin, so we could use inline block to say still flow within the text, but we're going to add some margin. We want you to respect the height and width that we've set. Very useful. You can also use display none, which will hide an element from the page. So it can also be useful. It's definitely useful for if you're building any sort of interactive application. I use display none a ton. Like say the user deletes something or hides a post or something like that, display none will remove it from the page. It's important to remember it still appears in your HTML. It's still in the document. So the user can still view source or look at the inspector and still see that element there. So you wouldn't want to use it for, removing something private or something like that. But it can be useful for hiding an element from the page. Another way of hiding boxes, so display none basically treats the element like it didn't exist. So no space will be left where it used to be. Your content will kind of reshuffle to fill in the gaps. But there's a visibility property that allows you to hide boxes from users, but still leave a space where that element would have been. So again, display none won't leave an empty space. It'll just yank it from the page, and the rest of your content will move up to take up its place. But you can use visibility along with hidden is the value, which will just hide the content but still leave empty space where it used to be. So that can be pretty useful. Or visibility visible will show the element. So again, they still show up when viewing source or using the inspector, so it's not something you can use to like hide stuff necessarily as far as sensitive information, but it can definitely be useful. Again, and these display none and visibility are more things that we're using when we've got some JavaScript going on, or maybe like hover or something like that. So you could have an image on hover be visibility hidden for some reason. So it would disappear when the user hovers over it, something like that. They'll use this a lot for like controls. I'm trying to think of an example. Well, like here, so this little thing down here, this is, the slide is just a web page, right? So there's some controls down here that when you, hover down here, they pop up. They're probably using visibility for this. You can inspect, I guess, and find it. This down. Punch viewer is the class. Interesting. It's probably this div here. So if we look, okay, they're using opacity. Yeah, so they're just setting it to fully transparent. They're not. That's so that they can animate it. So they set opacity to 0. So when you do hover down there, they kick off a script that adds opacity, over the course of a second or something, and goes from 0 to 100. But they definitely could use visibility hidden, and then when you hover in that area, now it sets visibility to visible so that it appears. Okay, any questions so far? All right, get this to go. Okay, box shadow. So we talked about text shadow a little bit already. Very similarly, we can also add a shadow around a box. It works just like the blank property. That's supposed to be text shadow. And it takes the following value. So it takes a horizontal offset. So again, negative pixel values position it to the left, and positive values to the right. It takes a vertical offset where negative go to the top and positive go down. It takes a blur radius, which is a distance in pixels for how blurred it should be. There's also an optional what's called a spread radius. So we talked with the text shadow how the shadow is just the same size as the text, and you can't really make it bigger. Adding blur radius just makes it more blurred, but you can't really make it like a bigger text size as far as the shadow goes. With the spread radius, you can actually say, okay, make the shadow larger than the box that it's representing. So it's a pixel value. Positive pixel values will cause the shadow to expand in all directions, so it just makes it bigger. Or you can use negative values to shrink the shadow and make it smaller than the element, which is really handy. You can use negative values to create like an inset shadow. So say you've got a box and you want a shadow that goes from the border inside, you can use the negative spread radius to do that. You can also do that with an inner shadow using insert. So that insert just kind of flips the shadow around from going out to going in. And then you provide the color. So again, spread radius and insert are optional, and then color gives the value. So again, usually you want to use something with some opacity settings, so RGBA or HSLA, where you can have an opacity setting, because you don't usually want your shadow to be fully opaque. You want it to be a little bit transparent usually. Not always, but. So here's some examples of box shadows. So this first one here, we've got these here. If you ever see these are what we call vendor prefixes. We're not really going to talk about them a lot in the class, but I wanted to at least show an example. They're not as necessary anymore, but it used to be you had to specify which browser. For some, these are CSS3 styles, and it used to be you had to, IE didn't support box shadow, so you'd have to specifically say Mozilla box shadow, which would be for Firefox, or WebKit box shadow, which would be for Safari and Chrome, and you had to specify those. You don't have to worry about that for the sake of the class. You can just use regular box shadow, and in most cases, that's all you have to do now. Sometimes, the reason for that is sometimes Firefox or WebKit will support certain CSS features a little bit before they're generally available, so you don't want to just say box shadow, because that's not supported yet, but Mozilla box shadow is supported by Mozilla, even though it's not a fully formed, fully accepted feature yet. So that's just an example. If you see that, that's what that's doing. But what we really care about is the main box shadow. And so for this first one here, we've offset it to the left by -5 pixels. So we moved it to the left and -5 pixels up. And then it's just got this medium gray color, which is a little bit darker than the light gray of the box. So we get the shadow that's up and to the left. For this one, we've added some blur radius. So again, if you don't include, your browser is smart enough to know that if it sees 2 pixel values and then a color, you don't have any blur radius. But if you add the blur radius in there before your color, then it knows that that's a blur radius. That's why you can just kind of leave out the optional keywords and your browser figures out what you need to do. So this shadow, 5 pixels to the right, 5 pixels down, and then 5 pixel blur radius. So here, obviously, it's not blurred, and here it is blurred. Then this third one, we've done the same, 5 pixels to the right, 5 pixels down, 5 pixel blur, but we've also added a 5 pixel spread radius by adding that 4th pixel value. So you'll notice the shadow here is bigger than the shadow here. And in fact, it's bigger than the box itself, because you can start to see the shadow expanding to the top and to the right as well. So again, the shadow here is bigger than the actual box it represents, because it's poking out on these sides, and then it's also much bigger there. So that's how you can make the shadow bigger than the element itself. Here's an example of where you would have no offset, so it's just a centered shadow. It's not offset in any way, like this one. So 0 and 0 for your offsets, because the offsets are required, so it has to have some value. And then we've got a 10 pixel blur, so that's going to kind of blur it out from where it's at. And it's that dark gray color again, so that's how you kind of have a centered shadow. It would probably look a little better even if we added, 1 or 2 pixels of spread, because it's kind of cutting off the corners, so you would actually want it to be a little bit bigger. But then here's an example of how we take that same shadow, no offset, 10 pixel spread, and we add the inset keyword. This can be anywhere in the order. I like to add it at the beginning just so it's obvious when you're reading your CSS that this is an inset shadow. But you can have it before the color or after the color as well. It doesn't matter. But setting inset makes the shadow go inside of the element. So it's kind of a neat effect. Okay, any questions about shadows? Box shadows so far? I'll walk through a couple of more examples here in a second. Okay, one thing we can do also, my battery's about to die, I'm going to have to plug in. We can use the border radius property to create rounded corners on any box. So, by default, our boxes have, sharp corners. Sometimes, especially if you have a background color or something, you might want to round the corners a little bit. You can specify individual values by doing border top right, border top left, border top right radius, so on and so forth. Or there's a shorthand where you can do border radius, 5 pixels, 10, 5, 10 for top right, bottom left. Usually, you don't need to change the border radius of each side. You usually want them all to be the same. Again, the border radius is in pixels. And you kind of have to play around with it to get it right. It's kind of hard to predict what the pixel value will be. But I think it's if the value of the border radius is half of the height and the width. So like if you have a square that's say 100 pixels tall and 100 pixels wide, and you say border width is 50 pixels, border radius is 50 pixels, that will create a circle. So if it's half of the height and width, that border radius is going to, loop all the way around and create a circle. So anyway, it's kind of a rough way to kind of understand it. I think, yeah, there's an example. Let me plug in real quick before this dies. So in this example, we have a border that's 5 pixels wide. It's solid. It's this kind of pink color, and then we've set a border radius of 10 pixels, and so it curves our corners a little bit with that 10 pixel radius. So that's kind of what the rounded borders look like. Definitely useful. That must be the last slide. Let me show it to you. I've got a code pen that this one that kind of gives some additional examples. Yeah, question? Just adding border radius. Yep. Okay, so here's some examples. I've kind of played around with these a little bit. So, here's an example of using max width and min width. So for this first paragraph here, if as I shrink my browser, the width doesn't go down because it's hit its min width. That's not true. It hasn't actually. There it goes. Once we get down to 200 pixels, there we go. So now we're, it's 200 pixels wide, but it doesn't shrink any smaller than that because it's hit its min width. Whereas once we're above 200 pixels, all the way until 500 pixels wide, and then it stops. It stops at 500 pixels and doesn't take up any more space. So that's useful. Let's set like a height of maybe 50 pixels. So by default, overflow is show, right? So by default, even though the height of this element is now 50 pixels, it still shows the content. That's just kind of the default. By default, your browser doesn't want to hide content that might be important. However, that obviously looks bad. So we've got two options. One, we could do overflow hidden, which will just cut off the content and not show what overflows. That's okay in some examples. But in our case, we want to still be able to read the paragraph, so we can do overflow scroll. And now there's a scroll bar in here, and we can actually scroll inside of the element. So that can be useful. Let's look at the box shadow here. So, here we have an inset one. If we remove inset, it'll go and it'll then be outset. We can do, maybe we want to offset it 10 pixels and 10 pixels. Now it's offset. It has a blur radius, so we could remove the blur. Sorry, it's now making this spread. Could remove the spread to make it the same size. So now it's the same size as the box. It's just still moved over. And if we remove the blur radius, then it's just the that same color. There's another. Oh, there's some border. So here's an example of what the inset border looks like. So we've got a 5-pixel inset border. So we could change this to solid to just be a solid line, or dashed to be a dashed line, or we could do outset, and that kind of gives it makes like the bottom and the right one darker and the top and the left one lighter. So if we remove the shadow, it's a little bit more apparent. But it sort of looks like it's standing out from the page a little bit. It's kind of a cheesy look. It's not very common to be used anymore, but it's an option. There's also embossed? No. What are the other? There's one or two other fancy options. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. But yeah, solid is usually what you want to, or is it double that does 2 lines? Yeah. Again, not very common to be used. It looks kind of cheesy, but it's an option. We'll leave this as solid for now. So these paragraphs have, some padding and some margin applied to them, so we can get rid of these for now. See what that looks like. to, yeah. Okay, so I've removed all the, well, there's still some margin coming from somewhere. But you can see without any padding, especially with the border, if you have anything thicker than a 1 pixel border, it's gonna cut into your content a little bit because there's no, padding applied inside of the border. So we can just add a little bit of padding, 10 pixels to kind of, let me add this to all of them. So that'll add, that padding around all sides. We could do 20 pixels for some more. Let's also do some margin to, space them out. One thing to keep in mind too is that adding margin will space the element out from, the far left of the page. You usually don't want your content going all the way up to the edge of your browser window. It just looks a little bit better to have some, margin on each side rather than going all the way up to the edge. So adding your margin there helps out a lot as well. I like to add margin just around the body as well, just to kind of space everything out. And then here's an example in this last one with doing the border radius. So if we did the same, value, it's just a, slightly rounded corners. But here I had a little bit higher value for the top left and the bottom right, just to kind of give it a little bit more interesting look. If we were to do, like, say we said width is 100 pixels and height is 100 pixels, then we could do our border radius is 50 pixels. No, I was wrong. I guess it has to be the same. Yeah, so if border radius is 100 pixels, it's still not quite a circle. Something's making it wider with the height. Not exactly sure what's... Oh, I know what it is. It's the padding. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Sorry, not non-0 pixels. Probably need to do min height as well. Oh. There's a good example of, oh, that's not even doing it either. Anyway, now I'm just kind of messing around, but that's how you use border radius, and it is possible to make circles. I can't quite get it to work, but I've got some other stuff going on here that's causing that. Okay. Oh, here's an example too where display inline is useful. So there's a list down here with 2 items. So again, by default, your list items will be, display block. So you've got, item 1, item 2. Maybe you want your list that, goes across horizontally on the page. That's a valid, style choice. So by doing display inline, those will now just be inline and not get new lines. You could also do, say though you still wanted like a, maybe even a min width of, 50 pixels or something. Obviously that doesn't take into effect because they're display inline. So if you do inline dash block, now they're going to have that width applied. That was a really subtle difference. If we made it 100 pixels there with inline block, you can see they're spaced out. But just inline, they're not going to be spaced out. The same goes for like padding too. So, even if we just had, or margin, margin 20 pixels. Okay, so the margin is still applied with display inline, but not the height and width. So anyway, any questions? Thanks for watching me mess around and try to get stuff to work. I'll put a link to this page too, again, on Blackboard, so you can mess around with it yourself. Again, most of these things you just kind of have to screw around with it, and you'll kind of get the hang of how to adjust it, how to make it work the way you want it to. So coming up, I added on Blackboard the next assignment. Let me double check the dates. Did I actually save this? I hope I did. No, sorry, this is last 2 years ago. It's due on 10/10/2016, which is not correct. So the next assignment is to do the city guide. So I mentioned this a little bit on Tuesday. So let me pull up on Blackboard so I can show you the objectives. So you have to do the HTML, and you have to do, there's a list of text styles that you have to apply. So make sure you just keep those in mind. This one's worth, I think, 58 points. So it's the biggest assignment we've had so far because there's a little bit more involved. And then the next assignment after this one is adding more styles to this page. So make sure you really think about, with your HTML, make it, something that you'll be okay styling for a while. So really think about how to structure it well. Sorry, assignments. I'm trying to remember what the due date on this one is. I think you have a week and a half. Let's say here when it's due. No, but yeah, so just make sure you go through these objectives. So include information relevant to users. So you have to have 4 or 5 of your favorite places in your favorite city. So it can be restaurants or parks or whatever you want. But you should have a decent amount of content, on the page. So at least 4 or 5 kind of points of interest, maybe some, history or other information about your city. You need at least one list, at least one table, again, with appropriate content that should be presented in a table. You need some images. You need at least, I guess, 2 images or so. There's no hard requirement, but just make sure you have some images. And make sure they're, sized appropriately. You don't want your images to be massive, unless they should be massive. And then that's okay, but make sure they're appropriate. Again, you can use the pixel editor if you need to resize the images. You need a form on your website. So the form doesn't have to go anywhere. It can be whatever kind of form you want. Ask a question, submit feedback, recommend a new restaurant, something like that. Whatever you would like. Make sure you structure your HTML appropriately. You should use some div tags to kind of separate major sections. Give each section an ID and a class to kind of, categorize those elements. Make sure you have a title tag. Make sure you have a meta tag with the description for search engines. So you'll have to look back through the notes if you need to remember how to do that. Make sure you have some comments within your HTML. Just kind of whatever is appropriate, breaking out each section or, making a note of something that you decided to do. You also need to embed a Google map on your website. So it could be a map to, your favorite place or a map of the city or whatever. Use some links on your website. So maybe have some anchor tags or anchor links that will jump to different areas of your website or to link to relevant external websites. So, a website for a restaurant or whatever. So once you finish the HTML, you'll need to create a CSS file. Thanks, man. Create your CSS file. I usually recommend naming it like style.css, like I have here, but you can name it whatever you want. But then make sure you add your link tag to include the CSS file on your page. And then there's a list of just some arbitrary styles that you need to make. So this is just to make sure that you've used the rules that we've learned so far in class. These are just all related to text. So none of the stuff we talked about today is in here yet, but that'll be on the next assignment. Make sure you go through each of those, set some fonts, set some colors, things like that. Okay, and let me double check when this is due so I don't tell you incorrectly. It is due on the 22nd. So that's what? Next Thursday. Okay, so you've got a week from today to do that. Also, I added to the calendar the third quiz. So the third quiz is based on the CSS introduction, so all the selector stuff, the styling text, and then this lecture on the box model. And it is also on the 22nd, so on next Thursday. So you've got a week to study everything we've learned in the last 3 lectures. I added all the slides to Blackboard, and I added the study guide to Blackboard as well. So make sure you pull that up and look through it. I think that's it. Assignment 4, quiz 3, and then right after assignment 4, we'll be, covering, adding some more styles for layout stuff that we'll learn in the next couple lectures. So, okay, well, thanks, guys. That's all I've got, and have a good rest of your week and weekend. I'll stick around for a little bit, too, if you need help with anything.